week. I wanted to thank everybody for coming to this webinar. We've had quite a lot of people coming every week, so thank you so much for that, and to also extend our thanks to all of our incredible speakers who continue to show up and to give their time to add to the discussions. We are incredibly grateful to you all. Right, as we are entering the slow release now from lockdown, the discussion is moving from response to recovery. We are committed to continue to bring you these weekly sessions on the topics that are important to you and your clients. So please do use our survey at the end of this to give ideas for topics you are wanting to address. Today we are focused on the role of philanthropy and social impact investing in the next phase, after response. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our member, Mary Rose Gunn, who is kindly chairing today's session. And joining her, Dr. Max Martin from Lombard, Odier, Nancy Bikson of Chapel York, Lisa Ashford from Ethex and Energise Africa, which are 2 investment platforms, and James Banks of London Funders. They will be discussing the challenges today and opportunities for the philanthropic and impact investing sector, and what they're going to face, and the role that they could play in helping our society. I'm so sorry, totally thrown today. We will be using the chat as normal, so please do post questions there and join us in the LinkedIn group afterwards. I will put the link in the chat. Any questions that we're not able to get to will go in there. So thank you very much. I will now hand over to Mary. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope that we can have an interesting discussion. I'm certainly very honoured to be chairing and to be joined by such eminent panellists. My name is Mary Rose Gunn and I am the Chief Executive of the Fore. For those of you that don't know, the Fore is a seed funder for charities and social enterprises. We are venture philanthropists, I think is what we would be called in the modern terms. We provide money and skills, but that is very much grant funding. And the skills is all about training to young charities and social enterprises, as well as connections into people who can help them with all sorts of different issues. But that might be a lawyer, that might be a finance professional, that might be someone who works in a hedge fund or who comes from private equity to help them write business plans. We work with lots of different people, businesses, funders, and high net worth individuals. So hopefully we have an interesting overview of some things. But collectively what we do with all our partners is we try and fill a venture capital role for the sector. What we have done in terms of responding to the COVID-19 crisis, which I hope is relevant in terms of the question, so you'll know where I'll be coming from, is that we set up a fund offering emergency resilience grants and also trying to connect organisations in with the urgent skills support that they need. And we are moving forward to a transition fund helping charities and social enterprises. We work with really small ones to move out of this. With our panel members, we're going to be focusing on a number of different issues, but particularly, obviously, the topic is the role of philanthropy and social enterprise as we move beyond COVID-19. But I think for what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be asking them more about what their constituents, the people that they work with most, where they are seeing the damage has been to the sector and damage to society, and what their constituents are doing and where they're concentrating their efforts. I will be asking them, I think, to comment on whether they think these are the places that are the right places, are high net worth individuals or the foundations that they're working with, in their opinion, do they think that they are concentrating on the areas that need help most, and what needs to be done and how we might be able to work together. For me, I feel that our role in the recovery is really important that we are all as flexible as possible and that we are facilitators and drive resources into communities. And what's keeping me awake, I think, is, are we doing the best thing to make sure the best possible job, to make sure that the organisations that are going to be able to survive, because there undoubtedly will be some casualties, but the organisations that are going to be able to survive are the ones that we want the most. I think the social enterprise model is really at risk because they generally operate without much surplus, shall we say, and they are often whereas some grant funded organisations are a little bit shielded because grant funders are being flexible, social enterprises don't have that sort of backing from funders who can say, oh, you know what, at the moment it's all right, you can do whatever you need with the funding because we're supporting you in the longer term. And this leads me to my first question of James. which is what, as the Chief Executive of London Funders, what does he see happening with reference to the possible closing of up to 50% of charities, and is it going to be survival of the fittest, not survival of the most impactful? James.
Thanks, Mary Rose, and good afternoon, everyone. I think we at London Funders, we've been running the London Community Response now for nearly 3 months. That's brought together over 60 funders and has so far distributed about just over £20 million out in grants to community groups across the capital, mainly looking at crisis, but we're now starting to work with those groups to look at what recovery and renewal looks like. And I think there's something quite interesting in that question, in a way, about the survival of the fittest versus the survival of the impactful in terms of charities, because I think some of the learning that I'd reflect on from the months that we've been working on this is a query about whether we're starting from the right point in the first place. Quite often I think we need to get down to actually what are communities, what are people looking for, rather than what are charities and civil society looking for. When we've tracked back a lot of the research, a lot of the learning before this crisis identified that the sector wasn't representative of all of our communities. Funding was not distributed in an equitable way. We've seen massive impacts through COVID-19 on parts of communities and people that traditionally had parts of civil society that's not been well resourced by funders. If you're a Black, Asian, minority ethnic-led group, if you're a deaf and disabled-led group, if you're an LGBT-led group, if you're a women's-led group, traditionally you will not have accessed as much resources. So I think sometimes if we get down to the right starting point on communities and people, and try and think about what needs to be met from there, rather than whether the charities are the right people to survive, I think is the question that we've been reflecting on a little bit, because I think quite often those questions about fitness and impact come down to definitions that funders would use. They're not necessarily always the ones that communities and people would regard as being accurate. And because of that, when we've looked at talking to people about what they actually need during a time of crisis and what they're going to need in recovery and renewal, generally that's ended up favouring, through the grants that we've given out more recently, smaller organisations working at neighbourhood level, working with communities who really understand what's going on in their place. Perhaps more so than some of the larger organisations that may traditionally have been thought of as the fitter or more impactful because of their ability to demonstrate that. So I think there's a lot of learning from how we're working at the moment that in an ideal world we'll be taking through into the sort of recovery and renewal phases, which are about how do we actually better track what our communities need and make sure that we're funding things that address those and enable people to achieve their ambitions. Because I think the learning that we had from previous crisis, we did the funder coordination after the Grenfell Tower fire, was that a lot of the things that we regard as a crisis, be it domestic violence, be it homelessness, be it violence affecting young people, these are crises every day in our communities, and some of the way that we work at a time of crisis actually needs to be taken through into our everyday. So I think sometimes challenging that thinking a little bit and just trying to make sure that we are being as impactful as we can be by focusing on where that needs to be, rather than necessarily looking at who's currently delivering it, I guess would be my reflection.
Thank you, James. That's a really interesting start. Nancy, could I move to you and ask you whether there has been an increase in giving from your perspective to address the COVID-19 crisis, and whether philanthropists, having given more, are now moving from crisis response to being strategic and entrepreneurial? Are they thinking in those terms, or are they retrenching?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. And just a word about Chapel York and where I'm coming from this. Chapel York is, we have foundations around the world, charities through which other charities fundraise in those countries. And we've got 7 at the moment. So really I'm looking at this from our executive directors and their standpoints. When the COVID-19 hit, we set up emergency funds so that people could join our foundations and access international funding. Quite simply, we started making grants more often so that we could get money through to people. And so really, has there been an increase in giving? Yes, I mean we all saw it with things like Captain Tom in this country, but every country and every region has been very different. I mean, there was initially a disaster in Hong Kong, for example, in terms of charities having huge amounts of problems, and then it started stabilizing, and then of course all of the political stuff hit. So in America, they spent a lot of time changing some of the laws so that there'd be more tax incentives to giving there, because they're big on their tax incentives. And now, of course, nobody's talking about charities whatsoever, because everyone's talking about the race problems they're having there. So the increase we saw was two different kinds. Obviously, COVID-19 related organizations were able to rush in and say, you know, we need money. But also other organizations, other charities who really need to keep going were able to come in and say, what sort of world do you want post-COVID-19? Do you want there to still be elephants? You know, do you want there still to be arts and heritage? And we know that's going to be a huge issue going forwards of those kinds of organizations. So we also saw that charities who were able to, in a very thoughtful way, it continued to engage with those people who had been supporting them, those philanthropists, those organizations, continued to want to support them rather than just rushing out to the marketplace saying, help us. It was really an opportunity for them to go to their core supporters and have it and looking at that. Does that mean that philanthropists are moving from crisis response to more strategic? I think that it really means that the world is slightly different. That one thing we saw, for example, is that individuals started taking responsibility for things that a lot of times had been looked at by charities. So local villages all came to support each other rather than having to go find a charity to do this for us. I mean, almost an old-fashioned, well, old-fashioned if that's the right word, but a traditional response to things where people took initiative for themselves and for their neighbors. So does that mean that we're going to be more strategic and entrepreneurial? I think it means that people will continue to be people. There will be organizations that will attract that kind of thinking and will do that kind of thinking. There will be philanthropists that will continue to be strategic, and there will still be those that will be philanthropic. I think we're too early to be able to see whether this is absolutely going to knock the charity field on its head. It's just, we're not there yet. I think we just need to see where we're going. It's a bit like, are we going to be able to get on an aeroplane again, and how much is it going to cost us to do it?
Thank you, Nancy. That's really interesting. Lisa, moving to you, in terms of social investors and social investments, with your experience in running your platforms, are you seeing an increase in the interest in your services and more investment? And is the sort of investment that's coming what the social enterprises are really needing at this moment?
Yeah. So I think we're probably in a game of at least two halves. And right at the start, you know, everything froze up as we went into lockdown, and that certainly, you know, put fear in my heart, as well as the team. But actually, over the course of the next weeks, things started to open back up again, and actually we're seeing increased investment coming in for the investments and the projects that we represent and we list. And I think that's for a few reasons. You know, one of them being that we've been able to reach actually some people who've been incredibly time poor before, and actually being at home and being under lockdown has meant that some people obviously are working increased hours, but it has meant that there is an opportunity perhaps for more of the retired members of the community who potentially have some liquid assets to look actually at more positive investing. And there was a government survey that also suggested that apart from those people who have been, you know, critically affected, those who've managed to maintain their salary, their spending is dramatically reduced. So again, that they have spare cash effectively to be placed. And again, people have been looking at how they can apply that. And you know, our three themes are fighting climate change, reducing poverty, and building resilient communities. And that seems to have hit, you know, a note really, and the sentiment that we're seeing is that, particularly in respect of Build Back Better, you know, people have been given an opportunity to look at their surrounding environment, their community, and think about what it could be like. But also their responsibility, as Nancy said, towards, and James, towards those other people in their community, and how can they do more. So, you know, because we're representing also quite grassroots organisations in some cases, the fact that they're quite democratic models in terms of the organisations, those are actually really appealing to people, because they have a say in how the organisations are run and how the surpluses are distributed. And that seems to be a bit more of a, you know, you could say old-fashioned, but you could also call it quite a radical move to put the power back in the hands of people, and recognising that you can do good with your money. So, I mean, I think we're really pleased with how things have been going over the last few weeks, and we're seeing particularly, you know, moves towards more green investments, more sustainable transport, and there's a lot of noise in the sector at the moment about more funding for sustainable transport, and, you know, more cycling, electric vehicle infrastructure, as well as green energy and things like affordable housing as well. So yeah, it's looking good. And are they getting what they need? Well, from our perspective, we're providing quite long-term patient capital. That's the crowd that's providing that. And I'd say that is absolutely what is needed at this point in time, is long-term patient capital. And in the UK, we've been quite sealed within sort of debt that's been provided by a lot of wholesale social investors, and there's a story and a context now which is suggesting that if we want much longer term recovery, we're going to have to provide much longer term patient capital, and so I think there is going to be quite a shift into more equity, more quasi equity in the long term, and that's something that we're going to welcome, but it's going to be needed, and a lot of blended finance, I think, grant and social investment together as well. There's a lot more innovation to be done there in the UK, I think. So we're looking forward to sort of continuing that conversation.
Lisa, thank you. That's really interesting, and moves nicely into my question for Max, which is that at this stage in the current crisis, what do you think that we should be doing to help philanthropists and social investors to prepare for the recovery phase, and help them make sure that they are providing the sort of support that is what is needed? And, you know, from what Lisa said and James said and Nancy said, and make sure that they are getting their resources out there in the most effective way possible.
Well, thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. You know, I hope you'll forgive me if I answer sort of Daily Mirror style, given the brevity of the session, and we can then go deeper wherever you'd like. So I think at a fundamental level, I think we all agree that we are really at a crossroads in a sense, because the voluntary model whereby private philanthropy and private investors produce social progress is coming under a certain level of challenge. I think we need to recognize that. For example, if you look at the Global Impact Investing Network, more than 50% of the respondents are based in the US, Canada, or the UK. But those are also the countries that have had significant challenges with COVID, as others as well, of course. And I think everywhere we see that the pendulum is swinging really from the entrepreneur to governments. And therefore, I think it's really important that we come back to first principles and ask ourselves, where do we have additionality? Where do we have subsidiarity and a real, say, leverage given the fact that, the stimulus plans of governments by far outstrip the resources available in the sectors that we cover. So I think that's point one. With that in mind, I think the good news is, what both impact investors and philanthropists bring to the table, of course, a desire to act in a purposeful way. I mean, we see that essentially every day. And I think, this hasn't gone away by any, if at all. I think that sense has grown stronger. And there's a demand for advice how to do it. The opportunity right now is to really separate the emergency responses, which are often really important but relatively low risk, easy to execute, from those that are more strategic, that go towards sector building. And I think there again, we probably shouldn't be holier than the Pope, and we should recognize that, if you have invested in an organization, either as a philanthropist or as an impact first investor, you care about these organizations. So at its intellectual level, we like this idea of the survival of the fittest, but I would say if it's the survival of those who are relatively fit, that's already pretty good, because those need support as well. What that means is, some attention needs to go into looking at the portfolio, which organizations are fundamentally viable if they're given a hand, which ones are really not, and an exit plan needs to be devised, both on, for investments, but also for charities that, for variety of reasons, are not really viable. I think in a sense, the good news is that this caring approach to social change is probably more needed than ever. And I think that genuinely new opportunities coming on stream. I mean, if you look at the whole, in a sense, acceleration of the digital turn, the fact that, at the end of the day, we are transforming how we work and connect with each other. This is creating questions as to, how to make sure that all these services that come on stream actually are really inclusive and environmentally sound. This is a natural habitat for impact investors, and also, I would say, in a phase before, to get support out to charities that help set the right framework. There's a lot of discussion, as we've seen, I think, on funding social movements these days. I think a big challenge will be the level of, say, self-reflection and honesty of all of us, because I think if we're honest, for example, we see that a lot of organizations have started to report in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, but I think we've also seen that the UN hasn't been overly effective, if I may say so, in playing its part in the COVID response. And the SDG financing gap already pre-crisis looked pretty huge. I mean, $2.5 trillion a year. I think what we'll see now is essentially coming back to first principles and asking ourselves, what do we really want to achieve with the communities that we're targeting at a fundamental level, and how do we update our impact frameworks to cover that? So I think we'll see a gradual retreat from these very large, very 10,000 feet goals that are not really connected in a fully causal way to what you can see on the ground. And I personally think that's positive, because what we see with the organizations and individuals we work with is that they have leverage when they work in spaces that they understand, where they have networks. This is really where you have subsidiarity, because you have capital that follows different constraints, and and care about a specific community that really would fly under the radar otherwise. So I think the most important thing that we can do right now as advisors is to, on the one hand, encourage good actions, or rational action, caring rational action with organizations that are being funded, while at the same time making sure that the depth of the transition isn't lost on those who stay in the sector, so that you don't spend all the powder, so to speak, that you have available immediately on short-term relief, when at the end of the day, the next phase is coming, and you want to make sure that certain organizations and value propositions are around. Needless to say, I think it's the most powerful way to intervene is to use philanthropic capital to crowd in investment capital at a later stage and make the market mechanism work. And I think, we see that the hunger for purpose and investments with purpose is certainly not impaired by COVID.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you, Max. Can I ask Nancy and James to respond on that, and also to Lisa's point as well about whether the funders and the people that you are talking to and representing and advising are answering the questions that Lisa and Max have just posed and the need that they have posed. What's your feelings? Oh, Nancy, please, could you come off?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Perfect.
Well, you know, I was just thinking whilst you were speaking, which is terrible, I know, Max, one should be listening to every word, but I was thinking about the small charities that are trying to deliver, you know, on the ground services, the ones that are looking after street children in Honduras, and some of the, you know, and so many that we see. And I was thinking, you know, they would listen to what you're saying and think, what world are you in compared to the world that they're in? And I think that's one of, and this is not exactly a COVID-19 issue, but it's the difference sometimes between the high level philanthropic discussions that we have in this kind of forum versus the sort of day-to-day how you actually deliver the services and how you survive, because survival for so many charities and so many organizations is so crucial that I wonder just how much time and energy some of these are going to have to think about themselves in the broader you know, world, which is, it's fascinating, but it's a very interesting difference, I think, from and it may, what it may do is move apart even more so the sort of philanthropic community from some of the more on the ground charities. I don't think I answered the question, but so I apologize, but it was still fascinating, Max.
Do you mind if I quickly respond?
You have about 12 seconds before
sure.
I need to.
You know, Nancy, I fully agree. That's why I think that the value add is proximity. If you know a charity, you care about it, then you can help them to do that. But we have a fundamental mismatch of capital pools. If the European Union puts out a 750 billion euro stimulus, and you know, we have a total global impact investing market, for example, of maybe 500 billion, then it's clear that we need to think through work where you know, deploy capital where you have networks, but let's not, you know, fantasize and think we can solve all problems. We can't. We just don't have the funds.
Yeah.
That's I think a good bit of realism to end on. John, you've come online to ask us about the 30 seconds. Shall I? Would you like me to go around the panel, or should I leave you to?
No, I don't mind. If it's okay, I'll do it if that's okay. But I just want to say that we've just barely begun to scratch the surface. And what I would like to do is bring you all together for a webinar that's an hour long, where we can actually go into more depth about this. So I'll be in touch with you all to do that, because I think it's been brilliant of the way we've started it. Okay, we've got just a minute or two left. Can we just go around and can you give us a 30-second final words of wisdom? And maybe we could start with James.
It's helpful to have 30 seconds because that's all the wisdom I have, John. I think the two things I'd share, I think, is that we need to remember that crisis to recovery is not a linear process. I don't think we're not going from chunk to chunk to chunk. We need to think about these as evolving and shifting pieces, you know, almost like waves coming in, and we need to try and help people to navigate that. And within that, I think the key for me is collaboration. No single funder, no single sector is going to resolve all of the issues that we're going to face long term. We do have to work together to tackle these for the future.
Thank you, James. Nancy.
COVID-19 has just been one crisis, and we've seen crisis after crisis now. So I think it's even more important that charities and organizations and philanthropists keep doing what they do best.
Okay, thank you. Max.
I agree with what was said. I think we are at the crossroads for both philanthropy and impact investing. And I think it's wise to, with a part of your funds, keep backing great organizations, and with another part, seek to influence the rules of the game. Because, you know, we need to deploy capital for purpose, but we also need, you know, good framework conditions to do that. So I don't think we can just allocate everything to crisis response. I think we need to keep building the market and keep building the framework and fend off some of the challenges against philanthropy, for example, and incentives.
Thank you, Max. Lisa.
Yeah, I think echoing what's already been said, I think this is an opportunity, and you know, I think it's time to sort of double down on effort and make sure that we're actually using innovation to look at new models and look at long-term shifts in behaviour and working together, getting more leverage is absolutely key. And we need to be a little bit careful, though, of there being any greenwash around Build Back Better, and make sure that it really has the right intentions at heart.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa. Mary Rose.
I think it's been such a pleasure to hear what everyone is saying, and I have been particularly struck by Nancy and James and the fact that we need to really make sure that we're listening to people on the ground in order to get the support, as Lisa and Max have said, into the right places. And it's going to be all about power sharing, and us in the positions that we are in need to be encouraging everybody to give up the power and to allow other people to help allocate the resources that we might have access to.
Okay, that's terrific, thank you. So it's not survival of the fittest, it's survival of the most impactful, I would assume. Thank you very much for this. I found it really intriguing, so good. Sophie, a final word.
I just want to say thank you, all of you, for your time today. It was a really brilliant discussion, and also next week we will be talking on the next stage of this, even though it's not linear, James. What kind of society do we want to build? So it'd be really great to see you all back again. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.